The snow falls thickly, blanketing the Ardennes forest in a layer of white as if trying to bury the violence that unfolded there. The air is frigid, so cold that the breath of soldiers freezes mid-air, shimmering in the dim light of early morning. In the distance, the sharp crack of artillery fire echoes, cutting through the stillness like a warning. The ground is littered with abandoned equipment and the jagged remnants of a battle not yet decided. Soldiers huddle together, their faces pale with exhaustion, eyes wide with fear as they listen to the rumble of approaching tanks, too close, too sudden. The sound of boots crunching through the snow is all too familiar now. For some, it's a reminder of their place in the nightmare unfolding before them. For others, it's a grim countdown to something worse. They know that the war is far from over, and that victory is slipping through their fingers. At the forefront, a figure stands, his features hardened, etched with the strain of command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who led the Allies to triumph in Europe, watches the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. The icy wind tugs at his coat as he gazes out across the frozen battlefield. For the first time in a long while, his mind races with uncertainty. The Nazis have launched a surprise attack, and the Allied lines are beginning to buckle under the weight of it all. This isn't the war he expected to fight. His calm, unflappable demeanor has long been his trademark, but today, it's as if the weight of history presses on his shoulders more heavily than ever before. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, one question hangs in the air. Can Eisenhower maintain his leadership in the face of an overwhelming assault, or will this moment change the course of history? Was this a stroke of fate, or a calculated move by the Germans to trap the Allies in their final push for victory? In the winter of 1944, Europe's fate seemed sealed. The Allies had gained momentum and were pushing deep into Nazi-occupied territory, inching closer to Berlin. The liberation of France, the fall of Paris, victories that filled soldiers and civilians alike with the hope that the end of the war was within reach. The Nazis, however, had other plans. Behind closed doors, Hitler devised one last gamble to halt the Allies' advance and potentially turn the tide of the war. The plan was bold, risky, even reckless, but desperate times call for desperate measures. In a final attempt to push the Allies back, the Germans launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest, a region that had long been considered a natural barrier. On December 16, 1944, the skies darkened with smoke, and the stillness of the snowy forests was shattered by the sounds of artillery. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Eisenhower, commanding the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, was caught off guard. Intelligence had suggested a lull in enemy activity, and the Allies had stretched their forces thin, advancing in multiple directions. The Germans, however, had exploited a weakness in the Allied line, targeting the vulnerable area in the Ardennes. Their plan was to break through, cut off vital supply routes, and isolate the American forces, creating a devastating bulge in the front lines, hence the name of the battle. For Eisenhower, it was a brutal awakening. The Allies' positions were spread too thin, their defenses weakened by overconfidence. In an instant, the momentum that had seemed so solid now seemed precarious. The news from the front lines painted a grim picture. The Germans were advancing faster than anticipated, their forces overwhelming the American defenders. Entire divisions were cut off, isolated, and surrounded by the advancing enemy. But Eisenhower, true to his character, didn't let panic creep in. He had built his reputation on calm, rational decision-making in moments of crisis, and this was no different. As the first reports of the offensive trickled in, Eisenhower called for a meeting at Chef. The stakes were higher than ever. The battle was not only about pushing back the German forces, it was about ensuring the survival of the Allied offensive and maintaining unity among the fractured coalition. The first hours of the battle were chaotic. Units were thrown into disarray, commanders scrambling to assess the damage and react accordingly. The Germans had managed to achieve their surprise, but they were not invincible. Eisenhower knew that the Allies had one major advantage: the resolve of the men on the ground. If the soldiers could hold on long enough, the Allies could regroup and counterattack. As Eisenhower gathered his senior officers to formulate a response, the magnitude of the challenge ahead became clear. This wasn't just another battle. The fate of the entire campaign in Europe was hanging in the balance. It was a test of leadership, of endurance, and of the unwavering strength of the Allied forces. Could Eisenhower maintain control, or would the Battle of the Bulge become the turning point that changed the course of the war? As the battle raged on, Eisenhower's next moves would determine the survival of the Allies' hopes for a swift victory. The pressure was immense, but the war, its future, was about to be decided in these frozen, snow-covered woods. In the early hours of December 17th, as the snow continued to fall in the Ardennes, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of the gravest moments of his military career. The magnitude of the German offensive, its speed and surprise, had rattled even his seasoned confidence. He had faced many challenges during the war, but the suddenness of this attack, its intensity, and the vulnerability it exposed in the Allied line were unprecedented. Eisenhower had long been admired for his composed, steady leadership, but this was different. The rapid penetration of German forces through the Ardennes felt like the first real setback the Allies had encountered in months. In the preceding years, Eisenhower's leadership had been defined by his ability to bring together diverse Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, and others, and coordinate a unified strategy. But now, for the first time, that unity was threatened. The Americans were on the back foot, and the Germans were advancing with frightening speed, cutting through the thinly defended sectors of the line. Despite the early reports of chaos, Eisenhower remained calm. He knew panic wouldn't serve the Allies well. His role as the supreme commander was not just to issue orders, but to ensure that those under his command could trust his judgment in the face of uncertainty. His leadership style was built on his ability to make quick decisions and maintain the morale of the troops, and now, more than ever, this would be tested. While Eisenhower maintained a level of calm externally, inside, the situation was beginning to eat away at his confidence. The Germans were pressing hard, and the weather, which had already been a challenge for the soldiers on both sides, was not on the Allies' side. Thick snowstorms were making air reconnaissance and supply drops nearly impossible. The enemy had an advantage in this terrain, something Eisenhower had not fully anticipated. But there was no time for second-guessing. The Allies had to fight back. Eisenhower's mind raced through the options. Should he call for a full retreat, consolidating the forces in a stronger defensive position? Should he reinforce the positions at all costs, even if it meant risking complete destruction of some divisions? The decision wasn't easy. Eisenhower's thoughts often turned to the soldiers on the ground, his real concern. His leadership had always been driven by a deep sense of responsibility to the men he commanded. The soldiers who were trapped in the Bulge were facing unimaginable conditions: frigid temperatures, inadequate supplies, and enemy forces closing in from all directions. Eisenhower knew he had to act swiftly, but also wisely. A wrong move could cost the Allies not just the battle, but the momentum they had gained throughout the war. In a move that displayed his characteristic clarity of thought under pressure, Eisenhower resisted the urge to make rash decisions. He ordered reinforcements to be rushed to the front lines while keeping his senior staff engaged in constant discussions about how to shift the balance. The Germans had overextended themselves. Eisenhower could sense that. He realized the Allied forces, though strained, were in a better position to regroup than they appeared. This wasn't a situation of inevitable defeat. It was a battle for survival, and that survival would require both strategic brilliance and sheer willpower. As the days passed and the fighting grew fiercer, Eisenhower's resolve hardened. The coming days would define his legacy. The Battle of the Bulge was no longer just a military engagement. It was a test of leadership, of unity, and of whether the Allies could withstand the might of the German offensive and turn the tide in their favor. Eisenhower knew that now, more than ever, his calm demeanor and measured decisions would be crucial in shaping the war's outcome. With the Allies in peril, Eisenhower's next moves would either secure their survival or place their entire European campaign in jeopardy. The Battle of the Bulge had begun in chaos, but Eisenhower's ability to forge clarity from confusion would be tested like never before. On the morning of December 17, 1944, as the first reports of the German breakthrough reached Eisenhower's command center, he knew there was no time for hesitation. The situation in the Ardennes had already escalated beyond anything his team had expected. He gathered his senior officers at SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, for an emergency meeting, one that would determine the fate of the battle and possibly the war. The atmosphere in the room was tense, filled with a mixture of urgency and unease. Eisenhower, standing at the head of the table, surveyed the faces of his staff. These were the men who had stood by him through the darkest days of the war, his most trusted generals, like Bradley and Montgomery. But today, there was no room for politeness or routine. The pressure was immense. The Germans had managed to punch a massive hole through the American lines, and their forces were advancing with terrifying speed. The Allies were caught off guard, vulnerable in the face of an attack that no one had seen coming. The Allied commanders were all trying to assess the damage, their minds racing with the options at hand. The questions were mounting. Should the Allies focus on holding the line, or was it time to consider a tactical retreat to regroup? Could reinforcements even make it through the harsh winter weather, and if they did, would they arrive too late to make a difference? But Eisenhower wasn't thinking in terms of retreat. His mind was fixed on one crucial objective: to prevent the German forces from splitting the Allies apart and creating the kind of division that could bring the entire European campaign to a grinding halt. The idea of pulling back and consolidating resources wasn't appealing, not when the fate of the continent seemed so close within their grasp. Eisenhower needed his commanders to rally, to commit fully to the fight and not allow the momentum to shift. He spoke with a calm authority that masked the immense pressure weighing on his shoulders. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is not just another battle. This is the moment where we decide whether we're going to finish this war or prolong it." His words were deliberate, purposeful. He needed his commanders to understand that this wasn't a crisis in the traditional sense. This was a test of resolve. The German offensive, while dangerous, could be stopped, but only if the Allies acted swiftly and decisively. The commanders around the table exchanged glances, considering their options. They had been through worse before, but this felt different. The weather was against them, and the Germans were pushing hard in ways that felt almost desperate. A final bid to salvage something from a losing war. The stakes had never been higher. Eisenhower listened to the reports and the analysis, his face impassive. But inside, he was weighing every word, every possibility. He knew that the decision to act quickly and decisively would either give the Allies the chance to recover and regroup, or it would risk the entire campaign being derailed. But his instincts, honed by years of experience in the field, told him that a retreat was not an option. After a tense silence, Eisenhower issued his orders. Reinforcements would be rushed to the front, and all efforts would focus on holding the line. The Allies would not surrender the initiative. The Germans may have gained the upper hand, but Eisenhower wasn't about to let them take the war. As the meeting concluded, Eisenhower's leadership would be tested in ways no one could anticipate. The Allies were in peril, but the question remained: could Eisenhower's calm under fire guide the Allies to a victory in the most desperate battle of the war? As the days of December 1944 dragged on, the brutal reality of the Battle of the Bulge settled in for both the Allied and German forces. The severe winter weather continued to ravage the battlefield, with temperatures plunging to unheard-of lows, and the dense forest of the Ardennes, typically seen as a natural barrier, became an unforgiving wasteland. The freezing conditions made movement nearly impossible, and both soldiers and equipment froze in place. For those fighting on the ground, it was a war not just against the enemy, but against nature itself. Eisenhower, in the midst of coordinating the response, began to fully grasp the scale of the challenge he was facing. The German forces, which had launched the surprise attack with remarkable speed, were not just attacking with their usual ferocity. They were attacking with a desperation that was palpable. They were intent on splitting the Allies' line, cutting off vital supply routes, and creating a wedge between the American and British forces. The Germans knew that if they could achieve this, they could severely cripple the Allied war effort. But Eisenhower also realized that this wasn't just a battle of logistics and strategy. It was a battle of endurance. The men on the front lines, who had already been fighting a war of attrition for years, were now facing the most brutal of conditions. Soldiers who had been battling fatigue, fear, and death were now tasked with holding a line against an enemy who would not relent. And this wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving. As the reality of the situation set in, the mood among the Allied forces darkened. The initial optimism that the war was winding down seemed naive. The men, many of whom had been pushing towards Berlin, now found themselves facing a threat unlike anything they had encountered before. The German tanks, artillery, and infantry pressed on relentlessly, forcing the Allies into a defensive position. The American 101st Airborne Division, trapped in the Belgian town of Bastogne, was surrounded, and reports of German forces advancing toward critical supply depots sent shock waves through the ranks. Despite these setbacks, Eisenhower's resolve remained unshaken. He knew that the Allies' ability to hold their ground would be determined by their leadership and their willingness to fight. Eisenhower was well aware of the men who would be bearing the brunt of this fight. His responsibility was not just to direct strategy from a command center miles away. It was to ensure that the soldiers, many of them cold, hungry, and scared, had the support they needed to hold on. His decisions, while grounded in military strategy, were also personal. He felt a deep responsibility to those fighting and dying in the snow, knowing that their survival depended not just on reinforcements, but on the morale and determination of the men who had been fighting for so long. But even as Eisenhower issued orders and coordinated the movement of reinforcements, he could not escape the harsh reality of the situation. The Germans had caught the Allies off guard, and the battle was now a fight to regain lost ground, not just to push forward. Every step taken by the Allies was met with fierce German resistance, and the sense of desperation began to rise. The sense of time was slipping away. How much longer could the Allies hold before the Germans managed to carve out their victory? As the battle raged on, the mental and physical toll on the soldiers began to mount. Men fought not just against the enemy, but against exhaustion, hunger, and the biting cold. The idea of retreat seemed almost impossible. To retreat would mean losing everything the Allies had fought for. The pressure on Eisenhower grew, but he remained resolute. He knew that the battle, as dire as it seemed, could still be turned. The question was how long the Allies could endure before their next move could give them the edge. The Allies' resolve was being tested with every hour that passed, and Eisenhower's next decisions would be crucial. Could the soldiers hold the line long enough to allow reinforcements to arrive? Or would the unrelenting pressure of the German offensive force the Allies to surrender ground they could never afford to lose? By December 20th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had taken on a momentum of its own, one that was pushing the Allies closer to the brink. Eisenhower had now come to a critical realization. The Germans, in their desperate push, had overstretched their lines. Their offensive had caught the Allies off guard, but the very success of the surprise attack had opened vulnerabilities of its own. The battle, though devastating in its early stages, was not yet lost. If Eisenhower could find a way to exploit the weaknesses in the German advance. After days of deliberation and receiving updates from commanders on the ground, Eisenhower approved the launch of Operation Stalemate, a counteroffensive aimed at stabilizing the front and slowing the German advance. It wasn't an all-out assault. Instead, it was a calculated move designed to halt the Germans' momentum and regain control of vital positions without overcommitting the already strained Allied forces. The first phase of Operation Stalemate was to create a defensive perimeter which would allow the Allies to regroup and reposition their forces. Eisenhower knew that the Allies' greatest strength wasn't just their numbers or technology. It was their ability to adapt, to quickly respond to shifts in the battlefield, and to turn moments of chaos into opportunities. The defensive lines were to be bolstered by reinforcements, but there was a catch. Those reinforcements had to come from the surrounding regions, and the weather, still holding firm with heavy snowstorms, threatened to delay or even halt any movement. Eisenhower's command over logistics, already under stress, would be further challenged. As news of the counteroffensive spread through the ranks, there was a palpable shift in morale. The soldiers who had been entrenched in the bitter cold and under constant fire now knew that help was on the way. But it wasn't just the arrival of reinforcements that boosted their spirits. It was the sheer determination that Eisenhower's orders instilled in them. For weeks, The battle had seemed endless, the outcome uncertain. The cold, the snow, the loss of comrades. It had all begun to feel like an exercise in survival rather than a fight for victory. But now, the Allies had a plan, and they had a leader who was not willing to let the Germans dictate the terms of the war. For Eisenhower, Operation Stalemate was a high-risk maneuver. The timing was everything. If the Germans pressed their advantage too quickly, the Allies would risk being overrun before they had a chance to regroup. But Eisenhower had confidence in his men, in the tenacity of the soldiers on the ground who had already fought their way through one of the most brutal winters imaginable. If they could hold on just a little longer, Eisenhower knew the Allies would have a shot at turning the tide. As the operation got underway, the weather played a crucial role. While it continued to hamper the Germans, it also slowed down the movement of Allied reinforcements. The strategic crossroads of Bastogne, which had been encircled by the Germans, became a key focal point. Eisenhower sent a clear message to the commanders there: hold the line at all costs. Even if it meant facing starvation or freezing to death, Bastogne could not fall. Its loss would mean the Germans could press deeper into the Allied front. The hours stretched into days, and the Allied forces dug in, setting the stage for the next phase of the battle. The question now wasn't whether they could stop the Germans, but whether they could outlast them. With Operation Stalemate in motion, the battle was far from over. The pressure was mounting, and the German forces continued to push forward. But Eisenhower had set the stage for a potential turning point, one that would depend on the resolve of the soldiers, the skill of the commanders, and whether the Allies could hold their ground long enough to push the Germans back. The real test was just beginning. As the Battle of the Bulge wore on, the men who had been thrust into the heart of the Ardennes found themselves facing an enemy that seemed unyielding, both in the ferocity of their assault and the brutal conditions under which the battle was fought. But it wasn't just the enemy they were fighting. It was the cold, the hunger, and the relentless exhaustion that had begun to take its toll on the soldiers of the Allied forces. These were the unsung heroes of the war, the men who would bear the weight of Eisenhower's decisions, who would stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The soldiers at the front were pushed to their limits. The bitter winter cold had turned their uniforms into little more than inadequate layers against the elements. Frostbite and hypothermia spread through the ranks, with soldiers losing fingers and toes to the cold, yet still they fought on. The pain was almost unbearable, but the sense of duty, of being part of something larger, held them together. For these men, the cold of the Ardennes was more than just a harsh climate. It was a constant, unrelenting presence that wore down even the most determined spirits. And it wasn't just the cold. The soldiers were outgunned, outnumbered, and often surrounded. The German forces, well-equipped and well-motivated, seemed to have an endless supply of men and materials to throw at the Allies. Every day, the line seemed to shift further back, only for a new line to be drawn in the snow. Soldiers who had been engaged in combat for months were now thrust into a desperate struggle, not just for survival, but for the very soul of the Allied campaign in Europe. There was no room for weakness or retreat. The wounded were carried off the battlefield, but the majority of soldiers were expected to fight until they could fight no longer. Those who remained, exhausted and starving, held their ground at all costs. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, encircled by the Germans in Bastogne, provided one of the most emblematic displays of that tenacity. Surrounded by enemy forces, with no reinforcements in sight and the cold cutting through their bones, the soldiers held out for days. They were trapped, but they were not defeated. Their resolve became a symbol of the Allied commitment to victory. The suffering wasn't just physical. The emotional toll was just as heavy. The battle was dragging on, and each day brought with it the loss of comrades, friends, brothers in arms who had fought side by side in previous campaigns. For every victory claimed, there was another loss, and the morale of the soldiers ebbed with each fallen comrade. Yet, through it all, they fought. They fought because they knew that they were part of a larger movement, a movement that could end the war and bring peace to a war-torn world. Eisenhower, observing from chaff, was deeply aware of the sacrifices his soldiers were making. It wasn't just a matter of military strategy for him, it was personal. The welfare of the men under his command weighed on him heavily, and the pressure of their suffering was a constant reminder that his decisions weren't just about tactics or logistics. They were about real human lives. He understood that every decision he made had consequences, not just on the battlefield, but on the soldiers who would bear the brunt of those decisions. The scale of their sacrifice would not go unnoticed. The Allies were beginning to make progress, pushing the Germans back inch by inch, but the victory was costly. The soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge were living in a state of near-constant deprivation, and their heroism went beyond the typical definition of battle bravery. They fought not only to survive, but to ensure that their comrades did not fall alone. In the midst of this devastation, their courage became the heart of Eisenhower's strategy. The soldiers' unwavering commitment to the mission was not just a product of orders. It was a testament to their belief in the larger cause, the defeat of the Nazis and the restoration of peace to Europe. Their sacrifice was something that would define the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge, as much as the strategies and decisions made by Eisenhower and his generals. As the battle continued to unfold, the sacrifices of these men would begin to pay off. The line held, and the Germans were starting to lose ground. The soldiers had endured the worst of the cold, the fear, and the isolation. But they still had a long road ahead. The true turning point of the battle was near, but it would be the soldiers on the ground who would ultimately decide its outcome. Could their courage continue to outlast the enemy's resolve, or would the relentless pressure break them? The answers were yet to come. On December 22nd, the Battle of the Bulge reached a critical juncture. After days of brutal fighting and the mounting pressure from the Germans, Eisenhower found himself facing a moment of truth. The situation had become dire. The lines had been stretched to their breaking point, and reports from the front were growing more concerning with each passing hour. The Germans, despite facing severe resistance, had made considerable gains. Their forces, now entrenched in key positions, threatened to overwhelm the Allies' already fragile defense. In a quiet moment, away from the immediate chaos, Eisenhower sat alone in his command center, pondering the weight of the decisions before him. His calm, measured exterior was a stark contrast to the tension building inside him. The stakes had never been higher. The success or failure of this battle, now teetering on the edge, could alter the entire course of the war in Europe. The Allies' unity and the reputation of the entire war effort were on the line. Eisenhower's mind raced as he considered his options. Could he afford to gamble with reinforcements that might not make it in time? Or should he continue to rely on the men already fighting, many of whom had been exhausted by weeks of combat? Could he hold the line long enough for a counteroffensive to push the Germans back? Or would that result in even greater casualties? For the first time in the war, Eisenhower felt the weight of indecision clouding his typically steadfast judgment. But this moment of doubt did not last long. Eisenhower's instincts, honed over years of military experience, quickly took over. He knew that if he showed any hesitation now, it would only spell disaster. The Allies needed a decisive response, a statement of resolve that could inspire the soldiers on the ground, remind them of the greater purpose they were fighting for, and, most importantly, give them the belief that they were not alone in their struggle. The heart-stopping moment came when Eisenhower made the call to hold firm and prepare for the counterattack. The decision wasn't based solely on military strategy. It was a moment of leadership. Eisenhower knew that a sign of weakness would fracture the Allies' resolve and give the Germans exactly what they wanted: division and confusion. So he ordered his commanders to reinforce the front lines with all available units, focusing on the critical areas that had been hardest hit. He also gave clear orders to continue to hold the line at all costs, knowing full well that every minute counted. What Eisenhower didn't know, as he signed off on these orders, was that the battle was about to take a turn that would test his leadership like never before. The Germans were beginning to feel the strain of their own overextended positions, and cracks were starting to appear in their strategy. The relentless push by the Allies, despite the odds, was beginning to force the Germans to shift their focus. It was at that moment that Eisenhower made an implicit yet crucial decision. His ability to inspire and maintain the morale of the troops would be just as important as any military maneuver. His voice, his calm presence, and his decision to refuse retreat had to reverberate throughout the ranks. The troops, surrounded by enemy forces and ravaged by winter's fury, needed to know that their leader believed they could hold on, that victory was still within reach. In that sense, Eisenhower's decision to remain resolute was as much about maintaining the spirit of the men as it was about the logistics of the battle. As Eisenhower walked out of the command center, he didn't feel the weight of the burden lifting, but rather a new clarity. The moment of doubt had passed. The Allies had a chance, however slim, to win. They were on the brink, but they weren't defeated, and neither was Eisenhower. With Eisenhower's firm leadership setting the tone, the next phase of the battle would depend on the unrelenting bravery of the soldiers and the ability of reinforcements to push through the freezing conditions and turn the tide. The outcome was uncertain, but the heart-stopping moment had passed. The question now was not whether the Allies could hold, but whether they could take back the initiative before the Germans could solidify their hold. On December 23, 1944, the weather seemed to hold its breath as the Allies prepared to launch a critical counterattack. Eisenhower's orders had been clear: push back the Germans at all costs. The lines were drawn, and the pressure to retake the lost ground had never been more intense. The soldiers, worn down by days of brutal fighting and relentless cold, now stood ready to execute their orders. For many, this would be the defining moment of their careers, the turning point of the battle that would either see them crushed under the weight of the enemy's resolve or emerge victorious in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans, stretched thin and overextended, had expected the Allies to falter under pressure. But Eisenhower's refusal to retreat had set a new tone. The counterattack, though risky, would not only challenge the Germans' advance, but threaten their entire strategy. Eisenhower had bet on the resilience of his forces and their ability to withstand one final push. If the Allies could seize the initiative, they could not only stop the German advance, but also start pushing them back from key positions, giving the Allies much-needed breathing room. The weather, still uncooperative, proved to be both a hindrance and a weapon in this phase of the battle. The thick blanket of snow, which had made every maneuver a slow and painful process, now became an ally. The Germans, like the Allies, were struggling to move their troops and equipment quickly through the snow-choked terrain. But while the Germans had made rapid gains initially, their supply lines were stretched and their forces were weakening. The more the Allies held their ground, the more the Germans' momentum started to falter. The first waves of the counterattack came from the north and the south, with American forces pushing forward along two key routes. To the north, the American 4th Armored Division, reinforced by fresh troops and supplies, moved through the snow-covered forest towards Bastogne. To the south, the 9th Armored Division and other infantry units began their assault, pushing the Germans back inch by inch, with the clear goal of retaking lost ground. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and costly. The Allies were already running on empty, hungry, exhausted, and freezing, but the resolve of the men on the front lines could not be underestimated. In the middle of this chaos, the defenders in Bastogne became a symbol of the Allied resistance. Surrounded by German forces on all sides, they fought not only to survive but to hold the critical crossroads that could determine the course of the battle. The town of Bastogne, though small and largely surrounded, had become the linchpin of the entire Allied strategy. Eisenhower knew that if Bastogne fell, the Germans would have a much clearer path to the heart of the Allied line. And so, in one of the most dramatic moments of the battle, General McAuliffe, in charge of the 101st Airborne Division, famously replied to a German demand for surrender with a simple, defiant "nuts." The spirit of defiance shown by the defenders of Bastogne would become the rallying cry of the Allied counteroffensive. Eisenhower's faith in his men was not misplaced. As the first waves of counterattacks pushed forward, the German forces, already strained and battling against the weather and their own overextended supply lines, began to lose ground. The German advance slowed, then stalled, and in some places it started to retreat. The weight of the Allies' counteroffensive was taking effect. For Eisenhower, this was a moment of quiet triumph. He had staked everything on the success of the counterattack, and it was beginning to pay off. The tide of the battle was shifting, but it was still far from over. The Germans were not yet defeated. They still held strong positions, and their desperation was evident in the increasing ferocity of their attacks. But the psychological blow had been struck. The Allies were no longer on the defensive. They were fighting back. The first steps of the counterattack had begun to show promise. But Eisenhower knew better than to assume victory was imminent. The Germans were formidable adversaries, and this was a battle for survival, not just a tactical push. The counterattack had disrupted the German lines, but it still required careful management and relentless pressure to secure a victory. The outcome was still uncertain, but the Allies were gaining momentum, and for the first time in days, there was hope that they could win the battle and, perhaps, the war. As the counterattack continued, Eisenhower and his commanders knew that this was only the beginning of a long and grueling road. The Germans were still in the fight, and the weather was only becoming more punishing. But the momentum had shifted in favor of the Allies. The next phase of the battle would test not just their resolve, but their ability to finish what they had started, and to do so before the Germans could regroup. By December 26, 1944, the tide of the Battle of the Bulge had begun to shift. The Allies, bolstered by reinforcements and a renewed sense of purpose, were pushing back against the German forces. The bitter cold that had gripped the Ardennes for so long remained unrelenting, but so did the determination of the soldiers on the front lines. The battle had taken its toll on both sides, but now the momentum was firmly with the Allies. The Germans, once so confident in their surprise offensive, were starting to feel the pressure as their lines began to buckle under the weight of the Allied counteroffensive. For Eisenhower, this was the moment of reckoning. His earlier decisions to commit to the counterattack were beginning to pay off, but there was no room for complacency. The Germans were still a formidable force, and their desperation made them dangerous. If the Allies hesitated now, if they slowed their advance, they risked allowing the Germans to regroup and counterattack once more. Eisenhower knew that this final push was crucial. The goal was simple: break the German offensive completely and ensure that the Allies maintained the upper hand. The Allies' strategy was twofold. First, they would secure the critical positions that had been lost in the initial wave of the German attack. Then, they would push the Germans back across the front, cutting off their retreat and leaving them with no choice but to surrender or face complete annihilation. It was a bold plan, but it was also the only viable one. The Germans had overstretched themselves, and the Allies now had the opportunity to exploit that weakness. The fighting was intense. Soldiers fought not only the Germans but also the relentless cold, the snow, and the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. The supply lines, though stretched, were holding, and the reinforcements that had been desperately needed were now arriving in force. Tanks rumbled across the snow-covered landscape, and infantry units advanced, pushing back the Germans step by step. Every inch of ground was contested, but the Allies were not giving up. They had learned the hard way that nothing could be taken for granted in the Ardennes. The Germans, on the other hand, were struggling to maintain their positions. The initial surprise of the offensive was gone, and their troops were beginning to lose morale. Their supply lines, already thin, were being cut off by the Allied advance. The weather, which had been an equalizer at the start of the battle, now worked against the Germans as their tanks and vehicles struggled to operate in the freezing conditions. The once unstoppable force that had surged through the Ardennes was now faltering, unable to maintain the momentum they had hoped for. Eisenhower's leadership, his refusal to surrender ground, had played a pivotal role in turning the tide. His ability to maintain unity among the Allies, even under the immense pressure of the battle, had kept the forces focused. His calm but decisive command had ensured that the men in the field knew what they were fighting for. The sacrifice of the soldiers on the front lines, their willingness to endure the freezing cold, the constant threat of death, and the harsh conditions, had become the backbone of the counteroffensive. They were the ones who, step by step, were forcing the Germans to retreat. By the end of December, the Germans were beginning to lose their grip on the Ardennes. The Allies had regained control of key positions, including Bastogne, and the momentum was swinging irreversibly in their favor. The Germans, exhausted and disorganized, were retreating, unable to hold the lines they had once breached with such confidence. The final push, though hard-fought and costly, had succeeded. The Battle of the Bulge was no longer a battle for survival. It was a battle of attrition that the Germans could not win. For Eisenhower, the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high, with thousands of lives lost, and the scars of the battle would remain for years to come. But the outcome was clear. The Germans had been decisively defeated in their last major offensive in the West. The Allied forces, though battered, had emerged victorious. As the Allies secured their position and the German forces began to retreat, Eisenhower knew that the war was far from over. The victory at the Battle of the Bulge had not only turned the tide in the Western Front, but had set the stage for the final assault on Nazi Germany. The momentum was now on the Allies' side, but the cost of victory had been steep. The question remained: could the Allies maintain this momentum, or would the Germans regroup and launch another desperate offensive? The final phase of the war was still ahead, but one thing was certain: the Battle of the Bulge had been a pivotal moment, and the Allies had passed the test. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but its legacy would stretch far beyond the frozen woods of the Ardennes. The victory had not come without a heavy cost. Thousands of soldiers, American, British, and German alike, had been lost, many to the cold, the exhaustion, and the fierce combat that defined the battle. The toll on both sides was staggering, but for the Allies, the victory meant more than just the recapture of territory. It was the turning point that would eventually lead to the fall of Nazi Germany and the end of the war in Europe. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the victory at the Battle of the Bulge marked a moment of personal and professional reflection. As the supreme commander of the Allied forces, the battle had tested him in ways few challenges ever had. His leadership had been under immense pressure, as the fate of the war in Europe seemed to hinge on his decisions. For days, Eisenhower had wrestled with uncertainty and doubt, but he had never wavered in his commitment to hold the line. His resolve, in the face of overwhelming odds, had been a beacon of hope for the soldiers on the front lines. But as Eisenhower surveyed the aftermath of the battle, he couldn't ignore the cost. The heroism of the soldiers who fought through the snow, the unflinching resolve of the commanders, and the bravery of those who held Bastogne under siege. These were the stories that would be told for generations. But they were also tempered by the grim reality that war, no matter the outcome, was brutal and unforgiving. Eisenhower had never been one to glorify war, and as he looked at the carnage left in the wake of the battle, he was reminded of the heavy responsibility he carried. The victory at the Bulge was a moment of triumph, but it was also a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made. Eisenhower knew that the war was far from over. The Allies had won a critical battle, but the German war machine, though weakened, was not yet defeated. The Nazis were retreating, but they still had the capacity to fight. For Eisenhower, the end of the Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of the final phase of the war in Europe. The push towards Berlin, the culmination of years of sacrifice and struggle, was now within reach. But Eisenhower also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There were more battles to be fought and more lives to be risked. In the days and weeks that followed, Eisenhower's reflection on the battle shaped the decisions he would make in the final push toward victory. He would not be swayed by victory alone. The lessons learned in the Ardennes would inform every move, every order, and every strategy. The Battle of the Bulge had reminded him of the fragility of the Allied coalition and the toll that prolonged combat took on both the soldiers and the leadership. But it had also reaffirmed his belief in the strength of unity, in the power of resolve, and in the indomitable will of the men who fought under his command. For the soldiers who survived, the battle would become a defining chapter in their war experience. Many of them would return home to be hailed as heroes, but they would never forget the horrors they had witnessed, the comrades they had lost, the impossible conditions they had endured. The Battle of the Bulge had tested them as individuals, but it had also bonded them in a way that few experiences could. They had fought not just for themselves, but for their fellow soldiers, for the survival of the Allied cause, and for the hope that the world would emerge from the darkness of war into a new era of peace. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as one of the most intense and decisive engagements of World War II. But for Eisenhower, the battle was not just a military victory. It was a moment of introspection, a test of his leadership, and a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made along the way. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Eisenhower knew that the events of the Bulge had reshaped the course of history, but he also understood that, for all the battles won, the true cost of war would be measured not just in victories, but in the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the long road to healing that would follow. As the final assault on Nazi Germany began to take shape, Eisenhower's leadership would continue to guide the Allies to victory. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge would remain with him as the road to Berlin grew shorter. The legacy of this battle, and of the men who fought and died in it, would live on, not just in history, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the bravery, sacrifice, and triumph against all odds.